The first letters arrived with ash still clinging to the wax. The riders who brought them looked like statues carved from soot. Eyes red, throats raw, mouths moving as if every word had to be dragged through cinders. The great hall of Winterfell held its breath while Sansa read, and the hearth's fire suddenly seemed small and polite beside the ruin described in those cramped lines. Streets melted. Children turned to shadows on stone. Bells that had begged for mercy drowned by a dragon's roar. King's Landing was not a city anymore. It was a lesson written in smoke. She let the letter fall. The lords of the North watched. Her, some with pity, some with the slow, practical fear of men who know a storm isn't done just because it spent itself on someone else's house. There were no cheers for victory, none of that grim northern satisfaction that the South had finally tasted winter, only a restless shuffling, as if the benches had grown splinters. They wanted to know what this meant for their daughters, their fields, their thin, stubborn line of quiet years after too much war. And they wanted to see what Sansa would do. She said she freed the city, young Lord Serwyn murmured, eyes fixed on the floor. Freed them from what? From the burden of breathing, Lyanna Mormont would have said if she were still alive. Sansa heard the girl's ghost in that echo, and the room felt colder. They asked for a statement, and Sansa gave them courtesy. She thanked the riders, ordered food, water, blankets. She said they would gather again at dusk after she'd read. The rest of the ravens perched on the table like small, silent judges. Only when the hall emptied did she let the mask slide. Her hands trembled so hard she had to hold them against the wood to keep them from shivering right off her wrists. She stepped into the godswood for the news she could not carry openly. The heart tree's face was winter blank, but the red leaves whispered anyway. She had learned to listen to silence. It was the only tutor that didn't flatter. The still air hummed with something that felt like memory and warning braided together. She thought of her father's head on a spike, her brothers, body sewn to a wolf's, the men who'd smiled as if the North would forget, the beautiful, charming monsters who had taught her how to read a smile like a threat. Daenerys Targaryen had looked at Sansa once with a softness that might have been real. It hadn't mattered. Sansa had seen the hunger under it, not just for a throne, but for certainty. The kind of certainty that steps on anything that trembles in its way and calls it justice. Fire was only the language. Arya found her in the godswood, light as a shadow, the way Arya moved now. She had come north, faster than anyone thought possible, half-starved and feral from the lower city's smoke. Soot still marked the line of her jaw. When she hugged Sansa, she was a small, hard thing, all sinew and winter resolve. It wasn't war, Arya said, voice almost flat. It was a choice. Sansa didn't ask if she meant the Dragon Queen or the man who had watched her fly. She already knew both answers. The North will ask for independence again, Sansa said, and she will say we've always been free. Then she will come to teach us what her freedom means. Arya's mouth twitched. Let her come. She'll find the snowbites. Sansa shook her head. There was the math of swords, and then there was the math of people. The Unsullied had no homes to defend and no families to bury. They were a blade without a hilt. And there was a dragon. The North could not stand against fire from the sky, not on walls and not in open field. The last dragons had been tamed by time and weakness, not by brave speeches. There were other letters, one from Tyrion, words careful as a man walking across breaking ice. He wrote nothing treasonous. He was too clever to be stupid. But he left gaps in the sentences wide enough for Sansa to see what lay between. He asked after her health, expressed grief for the dead, commended the North for sheltering the living who fled. In the last line, he mentioned that wisdom is a burden he wishes he didn't have to lift alone. He named no names. He didn't have to. Bran spoke that night in the hall. Not as a brother, not as a boy. He sat like a quiet moon and said things that sounded less like advice and more like roads other people would walk whether they wanted to or not. "A coin flipped many times," he murmured, when the lords were gone and the embers had settled. "It comes up the side you feed." Sansa's patience had been fed by years of learning the difference between fear and foresight. Fear made you run. Foresight made you pack. Jon's raven arrived near midnight, scrawled like he'd written it leaning against a wall that was trying to fall on him. He swore he would talk to Daenerys. He said there were better ways than blood. He said he loved her. And he didn't. And he wished he didn't have to know the difference. Sansa traced his name with one finger and felt nothing. Not because she'd stopped loving him, but because love wasn't a tool she could use here. Love would make her hesitate, and hesitation was what fire lived on. At dawn, she called the lords again. She spoke about winter stores, patrol routes, rebuilding the granaries, rearming the walls, the ordinary work of survival, which was the only kind of heroism she trusted anymore. She declared no banners against the Dragon Queen. She named no enemies. She asked no cheers. But when she dismissed the hall, the North had heard the part she had kept under her tongue. Prepare, quietly. It was after that the stranger came. To the kitchen door, clothes ragged, hands burned, offering a clay cup and a story about a healer in the city who had kept a little boy alive with bitter leaves and stubbornness. The cup smelled like dirt and ghosts. The woman spoke in a cracked voice about seeds that kill if handled wrongly, about tinctures that taste like old grief. Sansa listened without moving, without granting anything, the way she learned to listen. To men with pretty rings and ugly plans. She let the woman go with food and coin and a promise that was not a promise. When Arya asked if they were now poisoning queens, Sansa said they were collecting recipes. Winter kitchens should have many. Poison? Arya's nose wrinkled. That's their way. Hidden hands. Shadows. Ours too, Sansa said softly. If we're wise. Courage isn't always a shout. Sometimes it's a whisper that ends. A war before it eats everything. She walked the battlements alone at noon, the winter sun as pale as a washed bone. The air carried the clean smell of snow and the faint iron of the forge. Children ran between barracks with inexpertly stitched cloth dragons, their play almost cruel in its innocence. Sansa made herself watch until it hurt. She had learned to swallow pain like a pill. It kept her sharp. In her chamber, she laid the letters out and weighed them against all the lives she could count and the ones she couldn't. She remembered a queen who smiled at her as if she were a piece on a board. She remembered another, queen who smiled like a knife. In both smiles, she had seen her people burned or flattened. The world did not ask what she wished. It asked what price she could pay for choices she didn't want. Tyrion's careful gaps left her a narrow path. She wrote to him in the same careful way, with words that tasted like simple courtesies, but bent, if read right, toward a meeting that could be explained as reconciliation. Winterfell would open its gates to the breaker of chains. The North would lay down old distrust for the sake of the living. The queen would find warm hearths and honest bread. Sansa sealed the letter with the stark direwolf, and the wax swallowed the ash that still clung to her fingers. She did not lie to herself about what this meant. Invite a storm and call it rain. It still soaked you. But she also remembered a lesson. She had carved into herself with years of being underestimated. People who believe they are loved rarely look for the knife. At supper, she sat with the small folk. She ate turnips and oatcakes, drank thin ale, listened to complaints about leaky roofs and a pig that kept chewing through a neighbor's fence. She laughed once, surprised at the sound. It felt like a memory from a life that had lost its name. The people looked relieved to hear it. Relief was a kindness and a weapon. She let them have both. That night, sleep refused her. She stood at the window until the stars blurred. Snow began to fall, those first testing flakes that float like they're deciding whether to commit. She pressed her palm to the cold stone and thought about the weight of crowns. Gold was heavy, yes, but not as heavy as a promise. She had promised the North safety. Safety was not the same as righteousness. Safety did not wait for a man who loved too broadly to keep practicing hope until he found a way to make it hurt less. In the morning, a second raven from John said he'd try again, and a third from the south spoke in a stranger's hand. It told her the Dragon Queen had made a speech, that she spoke of breaking wheels in every land, of freeing people who didn't know they needed freedom, of a world where only one voice governed because it was the only voice that cared enough to burn for it. Sansa read it and put it aside, and felt something unclench, not in relief, but in certainty. She could not change what the Queen believed she was. She could only change the ground the Queen stood on. She called for Arya. She called for the master of the kitchens, the steward, the seamstresses who worked wonders with gossamer and steel. She called for the Maester and asked for simple things: calming drafts for guests, warming spices for wine, a new banner cloth that could be finished before spring. She wrote another letter to someone who neither loved her nor hated her but liked debts to be balanced. When she blew the candle out that night, the darkness felt busy. Plans moved through it like quiet animals. Sansa lay down without undressing and stared at the ceiling until dawn stroked color over the beams. The choice was no longer a cliff. She feared to step off. It was a road under her boots. The first step had been taken when she opened a letter edged with ash and did not look away. The next would be taken with a smile and a cup, and a welcome warm enough to make a dragon lower its guard. The first reply from Tyrion came with a wind-stung rider who had ridden through the night and looked ready to fall off his horse. The letter was shorter than Sansa expected, almost plain, as if a man who loved cleverness had cut away every ornament for fear it could be used as a noose. He thanked her for the invitation. He wrote that the Queen would welcome a chance to visit the North, to show that peace could still be built over the ruins of war. He added a single line that did not look like his hand at all, the ink too thick, the letters cramped. Warm wine is good for thawing stiff hands. Then a blot, as if the quill had been snatched away. Arya read it over Sansa's shoulder and snorted. "He's telling you she will bring a sword in her sleeve." "He's telling me two things," Sansa said, folding the parchment. "That the Queen is coming, and that he can only speak in crumbs." Crumbs were enough. Sansa had learned to bake a plan out of less. The days that followed were a drumbeat of small preparations. The kitchens were a hive, the air thick with clove and cinnamon, with roasting roots and simmering broth. Sansa made a point of tasting everything, not because she doubted her people, but because trust announced itself with simple, visible habits. She asked for the cups to be polished until they showed a face like a mirror. She had the casks drawn and relabeled, the strongest wines set aside for honored guests, the weaker ones saved for the soldiers. She had the cups counted each night. She listened to the steward complain and let him, because complaints meant a man felt safe enough to speak. Brienne stood at her door every morning now, a shadow of patient steel. "You ask me to stand guard," she said. "I will stand, but tell me if you ask me to do more." Sansa looked at the tall woman who had saved her more than once by being exactly what she said she was. "I ask you to stand," Sansa said, "and to see. There may come a moment when doing nothing saves more lives than swinging a sword." Brienne nodded once, though Sansa could feel the itch under that nod. The night's hunger to meet danger with something she could hold in her hand. Sansa remembered that itch too well. It had once driven her to try to please men who only sharpened themselves on her. She had learned that sometimes the bravest thing you could do with a blade was let it rest in its sheath. From the south came more news. The Unsullied had taken command of the streets that were still streets. The Red Keep, cracked but defiant, had been turned into a camp for orders barked in a language that had never known a mother's lullaby. Grey Worm was said to move like a shadow that had learned to hate light. Those who dared speak of mercy had learned to swallow their words. A new banner hung over the gates. A black field, a red dragon. People bowed to it because kneeling was easier when you were exhausted. There were rumors, too, soft as soot in the air, that Jon had tried to meet Daenerys alone and was turned away by men who did not recognize him as anything but another mouth that might say no, that Tyrion had been seen on the steps of the throne room, hands locked behind his back as if to keep them from doing something he could not command them not to do, that the Queen had spoken to her army in a voice that shook the ash loose from the stones and promised a world made clean by fire. A few called it madness in whispers, more called it destiny, louder. People often confused the two when they were afraid. Sansa read each rumor as if it were a coin dropped in a bowl, weighing the sound. She did not trust the words, but she trusted the patterns. Men tightened their grip when they felt the rope loosen. Queens smiled wider when they wanted to hide their teeth. She sent another raven to Tyrion, threaded again with courtesies that could be read two ways if you tilted them toward the light. She wrote of northern hospitality and the health of the Queen, of their desire to ease the stiffness of travel. She had the master bring her every book on herbs and wines. They were old, some of them, their pages soft with handling, the drawings of leaves more art than truth. He pointed out gentling roots and bitter bark, lullabies for the heart, little sleeps and long ones. Sansa listened, asked questions only about comfort and calm, and did not write down the answers. She kept them where no one could read them, but her Arya did not sleep much. She moved through Winterfell like a cat that had learned to be wind. She watched the guards, corrected a stance here, a habit there, never loudly. She slipped out at night and came back at dawn with frost on her collar and news from the road. The Queen's advance parties, the wagons that followed to feed the faceless soldiers, the riders who scouted ahead with two straight backs and two clean. They move like a song, Arya said. A hard one. If we fought them in the open, we'd be dead before someone finished the first verse. Sansa nodded. We won't fight them in the open. You mean we won't fight them at all? Arya's eyes were not accusing. They were bright, interested, like a girl watching a trick she wanted to learn. We'll fight them in the only way they don't expect from us, Sansa said. We'll make them think we agree. The memory of Cersei drifted through the room, uninvited. Another queen who had come north smiling and left the world worse. Sansa let the memory pass. This was not that woman. This was fire made flesh, and fire did not scheme the way snakes did. It believed it was a cure because it had never learned to be anything but a fever. A quiet visit came from Davos Seaworth 2 nights after the moon thinned. He arrived with 2 men and no banners, smelling faintly of the sea he always seemed to carry inside his bones. He sat at Sansa's table like a man who had learned to dislike chairs meant for important people, and yet sat anyway because it was polite. He told her he was only passing through to White Harbor, that ships needed mending and hearts needed calming, but his eyes said other things. He had learned, like her, to speak in weather. I hear the Queen may wish to visit the snow, he said, sipping ale slowly, as if each swallow needed gentle convincing. She will be welcomed, Sansa replied. Aye, Davos said. It's good to welcome dangerous weather like you expected. Makes folks step carefully, keeps roofs tight. Sometimes, he paused, searching for words that would not cost anyone their head. Sometimes storms pass quicker if the sea lies still. Thank you for the wisdom, Sansa said. She meant it. There were so few people left who offered advice that was not a demand in disguise. When he was gone, Sansa stood long at the map table. The carved dire wolf watched with its wooden eyes while she moved the little dragon piece north an inch, then another. She did not place it at Winterfell's gate. She let it hover on the road, the way a thought hovers on the tip of a tongue. She moved a ram's headpiece from the Umber's old lands, a trout from the river, a mockingbird that had somehow survived in the drawer of pieces no one wanted to touch. She placed them not to prepare a battle, but to draw a picture in her mind of how panic might spread if she failed. It was a map of mistakes she refused to make. Bran rolled into the room without a sound. He watched her fingers hover over the pieces. "You are building a future that people can live inside," he said, as if reciting a note he'd taken from the air. "It's a harder craft than building a victory." "If I build the future wrong," Sansa said, "there will be no one left to live inside it." Bran tilted his head. "There are many futures. Some end in quiet, some end in snow, some end in songs that lie." He blinked, and for a moment he was only a boy with tired eyes. "People who think they are the only ones who know the right road often don't see the cliff." "Does she see it?" Sansa asked, not sure if she wanted an answer. Bran looked at the dragon piece on the road. "She sees a bridge where there isn't one. She believes it will hold because she is the one walking." Sansa let out a breath. It left her feeling both lighter and sadder. "And Jon?" "He will try to be a bridge," Bran said. "He will stand where feet should not stand. He will hold until he can't." Sansa could not pull Jon back from whatever edge he had chosen. She could only choose her own terrain and make sure it did not crumble beneath those who depended on her. The announcement finally came on a cold morning that made the castle stones ring like glass when you tapped them. A banner rider sighted on the ridge, white breath puffing from the horse's mouth. The horn sounded once, twice. Men moved to their stations with the sluggish speed of bodies that had decided they were tired of winter but had not been asked their opinion. Sansa waited at the gate with Brienne at her shoulder, Arya on the wall above like a snow-bent branch that could spring back at any moment. At any moment. The rider's flag was the Targaryen sigil, cut smaller than most, as if the man who carried it did not trust fabric as much as he trusted fear. He bowed from the saddle, announced in formal tones that Her Majesty Daenerys Stormborn, first of, her name, would visit Winterfell within 6 days. He specified the numbers. A dignified escort, not an army, though even a dignified escort sounded like an army when you said it aloud. He named Grey Worm and a handful of advisors. He did not name Tyrion, but the way he paused before finishing told Sansa what she needed. She saw the space where the name should have been, like a tooth taken from a smile. "You will be welcomed," Sansa said, and smiled with all the warmth she could put into a face that had grown skilled at not showing its edges. After the rider left, Arya dropped from the wall, silent as ever. 6 days, she said. "If you're going to change your mind, that's how long you have to lie to yourself first." "I'm not changing my mind," Sansa replied. The certainty surprised her with its calm. "If I flinch now, I will. Flinch later, and later will cost more." They spent the 6 days like misers spend coins, each hour given to a small task. New rushes were laid in the hall. The guest chambers were warmed for days, so the stones would not bite like teeth. The kennels were moved farther from the eastern tower, so barking would not break the sleep of those who came, or the work Sansa meant to do in that sleep's shadow. The seamstresses finished a new cloak for Sansa, white with a thread of red like a living vein. It was beautiful and heavy. She wore it once around her chambers to learn the weight, so it would not make her bow when people watched. On the 5th night, she sat with the cup from the soot-marked healer. It looked ordinary again, as if it had learned to behave. It was not the cup that mattered. It was what a cup could mean when held out by steady hands. She set it down and forced her gaze away. She had to love the North more than she hated what the world had made of her choices. The sixth dawn broke clear, a sky scrubbed blue by cold. A line of riders darkened the southern road, small as ink flecks at first, then shapes, then men and women and steel. The dragon did not come in the sky. For a breath, Sansa thought perhaps the queen had chosen humility. Then she felt it, a pressure on the air itself, a low hum like a giant's breath against the back of her neck. The shadow passed over them, and Winterfell bowed not because it meant to, but because everything that lived under the sun bends when a dragon passes. The great beast circled once, twice, and landed beyond the outer field, snow steaming under. Its belly. Men steadied their horses, more for themselves than the animals. The gates opened. Sansa stepped forward with her smile, her cloak, and her decision wrapped as tightly around her as the winter air. "Welcome to Winterfell," she said. When the queen drew close, her silver hair bright as a blade, her eyes the pale of sky over deep water. "We are honored you have come so far." "We have all come far," Daenerys said, and her smile was almost kind, almost tired, almost human. It was all those almosts that frightened Sansa most. Almosts made people forgive what they would not. Forgive if they looked straight on. Sansa bowed. She did not break. "Come," she said, turning toward the hall warmed for days. "Let us put down our burdens. There is warm wine for stiff hands." She let the words rest where Tyrion might find them, and Daenerys might not. The queen nodded and followed, and the Dragon Queen's shadow slid over the stones like a prophecy that hadn't decided whether it was blessing or curse. Winterfell swallowed. The visitors like a great old animal that had learned to hide its teeth. Fires burned high. Bread came hot from the ovens. The air smelled of cloves and meat and wet wool. Sansa walked beside Daenerys through the great hall with Brienne a step behind and Arya above them on the landing, eyes never still. The Unsullied filed in with a soft rhythm of boots and breath, not loud, not clumsy, just total. They moved like a lesson. Grey Worm's face did not change even when the heat hit him. Tyrion came last, thin and tight, his eyes flicking from the cups to the hearth to Sansa's hands and back again, as if counting small things might save big ones. There was no throne here, only the high seat by the hearth and the weight of the room. Sansa offered the queen the place closest to the flames. It was an old courtesy and a small test. Daenerys took it without flinching, as if heat could never bite her. The hall filled with lords and captains and faces roughened by wind. Some of them stared at the Dragon Queen like she was a story that had escaped its book. Some stared the way men look at a winter river that looks solid but murmurs underneath. Sansa saw Jon at the far end, shoulders bent in that way he had when he carried more than his own sadness. He had ridden with the Southern Party, but he had not ridden near. Now he came forward through the crowd, eyes on Daenerys, then on Sansa, and he looked like a bridge that had been walked on too often. He kissed Sansa's cheek, rough and quick, and his whisper was only 2 words: "Be careful." It was not a warning so much as a prayer thrown at a sky that had stopped answering. They drank spiced wine from silver cups. Sansa drank first, tipping the cup so everyone could see. She laughed at something small Tyrion said about northern winters chewing on Lannister bones just to see if they tasted like gold. He did not smile with his eyes. Daenerys spoke softly at first, to the lady of Karstark, to the steward, to a girl who brought more bread. She asked names and used them. She said, "Your people and our future," and the phrases bent in the air like branches weighted by snow. After food, after the hum of talk settled into a gentle buzz, Daenerys stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Sound wanted to be near her. She spoke about ending chains. She spoke about building a world where no child would be born to fear a man's boot or a lord's mood. She said the war was not done, not truly, because the old ways had not yet learned they were dead. She said she would help the North bury those ways, and she smiled when she said help, as if it were the kindest word she knew. Sansa listened with a face that was all welcome. Inside, she felt the same cold she felt standing on the wall in storms. It was a clean cold, the kind that makes your breath show you're still alive. She could have respected the speech if it had not stepped so neatly over the line where choice lived. Daenerys said freedom like it meant obedience that had been kissed first. When the queen finished, the hall stayed quiet a heartbeat too long. Then men cheered, some because they meant it, some because they had learned that cheering was cheaper than blood. Jon did not cheer. He stared at the fire like it owed him an answer. Arya slipped away, not needing to watch more. Grey Worm met with Sansa's captains in the afternoon, standing straight as an arrow in a snowdrift. He spoke clear and spare. He wanted patrols doubled, watches mixed, unsullied with Northmen, so no one grew soft. He wanted lists of young men and women willing to serve the new world, and he said willing like a door that only opened one way. He wanted the forges working night and day. He wanted the kennel moved, the stables checked, the grain counted, the ravens watched. It was a plan for occupation, spoken as a plan for safety. Sansa nodded, wrote notes, thanked him. She gave ground like a dancer measuring a room. After, she asked her steward to send warm cloaks to the unsullied barracks and extra oil for their lamps. Kindness was a rope that could trip men who were used to being hated. Tyrion found Sansa by the window near dusk, his breath showing white in the draft. He spoke without looking at her. "The wine is excellent. Cloves hide many sins," she said. "Some sins don't hide," he murmured. "They think they're virtues with smoke on them." He rubbed his thumb against his forefinger, a nervous man's prayer. "She believes what she says, you know. That's the worst part. Sincere tyrants always sleep well." Sansa did not ask him to choose. He had already chosen the only way. He could and still be himself. "There will be a feast tomorrow," she said. "We will thank the queen for her visit before she rides to inspect the eastern road." He glanced at her then, quick and sharp. "A feast is good. Feasts are safe. So many witnesses. So many to share the memory of how polite we all were." He smiled like a man at a funeral who sees a child waving. "I will help you keep the peace, Lady Stark, for as long as peace lets anyone breathe." Arya came to Sansa after dark with the smell of cold in her hair and soot that had never washed out of her collar. She sat cross-legged on the rug like a girl and spoke like a soldier. She told Sansa more of King's Landing, not the big fires everyone had seen, but the small ones, beds that had burned with old men still in them, a cat whose fur had melted into its skin, a baker who had held his little boy under him against the street and turned to stone and shadow. She spoke softly, and Sansa let the words bruise her. Bruises were reminders to do what shame and pity could not. "There are people here who will listen to her," Arya said. "She says brave things. She believes them. That's a hard song to sing against." "I'm not singing," Sansa said. "I'm building a door. She'll call it a wall." "She can call it a dragon if it helps," Sansa answered. "So long as it holds. Long as it holds." In the yard, the dragon slept like a mountain that had decided to soften for a while. The stable boys stood far away and stared with their mouths half open. Boys who had grown on tails and now learned what a tail smells like when it breathes on you. Dogs kept their distance. Even the ravens were quiet, as if sound itself had learned respect. Jon came late after the patrols changed. He stood in Sansa's room like a man who had forgotten how to set his sword down. He said he had tried to tell Daenerys that the North would only ever be loyal if it chose to be. He said he had told her mercy was strength, not weakness, and that fear was a poor roof in winter. He said she had looked at him with love, the kind that wants you to be someone else, because that would make the world simpler. He looked tired and older and lost. "She will not let us go," Sansa said. "I know," he whispered. "Then we must find our own way out." He stared at her. "What are you going to do?" "What I have to," she said. "What you can't." His jaw worked. He wanted to argue, and there was nothing left in him that believed argument could save anyone. He nodded once, harshly, then left before he could ask her to be kind when kindness would kill. Morning came bright and brittle. Sansa walked the walls while the world woke. The Unsullied drilled, the smith hammered, the kitchen chopped. The sound of Winterfell doing what it knew how to do was almost enough to make her believe nothing had changed. But everything had changed. There was a dragon in the field, and a queen by her fire, and a word like freedom being shaped into a cage. By noon, the queen had ridden to the eastern road with Grey Worm to look at the trees and the stones as if they might decide to kneel. Tyrion stayed behind on some pale excuse about books and cold feet. He found Sansa again with a smile that did not quite make it to his mouth. "Did you know," he said lightly, "that in some parts of the world there's a custom where the host drinks first from the guest's cup to show love? Very inefficient, if you ask me. The cups get passed around like gossip." "In the North," Sansa said, "we pour from the same jug but keep to our own cups. It is cleaner." "Practical," he said. "Practicality is a kind of mercy." She watched the road where the queen would return. She watched the shadow that followed behind every choice a ruler makes. She thought about seed and bark and leaves, and how sometimes sleep can be a blessing if it arrives before someone dreams themselves into a monster. She did not feel like a villain. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like a woman standing between a flame and everything she had promised not to let burn. The feast would be tomorrow. There would be toasts. There would be music. There would be warm wine for stiff hands. And if winter was kind, there would be an end to this before the snow learned the taste of dragon fire. Snow fell steady the morning of the feast, thick flakes that made the world soft at the edges. Winterfell breathed it in and seemed to grow quieter, as if the castle itself wanted to listen closely to every footstep and every word. Sansa walked early, checking what others had already checked, and still checking again. The benches were set. The cups were counted, polished, set in neat lines that caught firelight. The kitchens moved like a single creature with many hands. She spoke to no one more than she had to. When she did speak, it was about salt or wood or doors that stuck in the cold. The small things held the big thing up. Daenerys did not come down until the sun had pushed the morning into afternoon. She wore white trimmed with gray, as if she'd dressed herself in a winter story and meant to become its ending. Her hair was perfect. Her hands were bare. She looked rested, and Sansa wondered if dragons dreamed warm dreams while human hearts froze beside them. Grey Worm walked at her shoulder, steady and silent. Tyrion followed a pace behind, his eyes flicking over the hall like a man counting exits. Jon was already there, earlier than anyone, like a man who believes if he stands still long enough, the world might decide not to move. He greeted Daenerys with a careful warmth that said he remembered love the way you remember a hearth in a ruined house. It had once kept you alive. He greeted Sansa with a look that asked for mercy and hated itself for asking. She gave him a small nod and nothing else. Too much would have broken something in both of them. Music started, low and simple at first. Fiddle, drum, a pipe. Northern songs about weather and bread and stubborn cows. The kind of music that keeps people from thinking too hard about the things that could knock on their doors at night. Sansa let it build. She had asked the players to keep it bright, to lift the edges of fear so talk could slip under. Laughter came in cautious little spurts, like rabbits testing a field after a hawk has passed. The first toast was to the living. Sansa lifted her cup high and spoke about survival, about how the North had always known how to hold fast to each other when the wind tried to take them apart. She spoke about neighbors and children and the simple heroism of getting up when it is dark and making a fire so others can wake to heat. She kept her voice even. She did not look at Daenerys when she said the words about fires that help. She drank first. Everyone saw. Daenerys stood and answered with a toast to unity. Her voice was smooth, warm, almost tender. She spoke of wheels and chains and a world that could be better if people would only be brave enough to cut out the rot. She said "we" a lot. She said "together," as if it were a spell. When she finished, there was clapping, real in some, corners polite in others. Grey Worm did not clap. He did not drink. He watched the room like a man waiting for a blade to fall somewhere he couldn't see yet, which is how men like him feel when other people are in charge. The serving began in long waves, trenchers of meat, bowls of stewed turnips, loaves of crusty bread that steamed when torn. Sansa ate. She spoke to the baker's daughter about the oven's heat. She asked the steward if the western doors had been fixed since last storm. She complimented Daenerys on her endurance, the way she had, borne the long ride north without complaint. Daenerys smiled, a small crescent moon of a smile, and said the cold was different than she expected, cleaner, almost honest. Sansa said winter tells the truth by making everything simple. You are warm or you are not. You live or you don't. They both knew they weren't talking about weather anymore. Tyrion slipped beside Sansa as the players shifted to a livelier tune. He kept his eyes on the far hearth, where the shadows jumped. "You do this well," he said softly, making a hall feel like a heart. "It is a heart," she said. "If it stops beating, the limbs go numb." "Some surgeons cut to save a heart," he murmured. "Some cut because they like the knife. Do you think I like the knife?" "I think you learned what it weighs," he said, and drifted away before she could answer. Near the high table, the cups for the toasts stood in a neat line, silver catching firelight and throwing it back in small, steady flashes. Sansa had chosen them herself that morning, the old Stark set with tiny wolves chased along the rims. She felt their weight earlier, the cold of them, and held on to the feeling now like a rope over a dark river. She kept the order easy. First the steward, poured for the small folk who had served longest, a kindness meant to be noticed. Then the captains and the ladies of the nearby houses, then a line of cups for the high table. Sansa could have left it to a servant, and she almost did, but she stood, as if casually, and took the ewer from the steward with a nod. Her hand did not shake. She poured for Brienne, for Tyrion, for Jon, for Grey Worm, for Daenerys, and lastly for herself. The wine smelled of cloves and orange, of warmth promised to cold bones. She raised her cup and spoke a few final words about travelers finding rest, about doors opening, about hearths that kept faith with winter. Her voice carried because people wanted it to, and because walls will sometimes hold a voice up the way they hold heat. She touched her lips to the cup first. She swallowed. She let everyone see the simple human act of trust. Then she turned to Daenerys and offered the cup with both hands. For a heartbeat, all the hall narrowed to that small circle of silver, to the space between two women who had both learned to wear. Crowns made heavier by the hands that had tried to take them. Daenerys looked at Sansa's face, not the cup. Her eyes were calm. They were not cruel. They were sure. She took the cup and the room seemed to breathe out, some with relief, some with fear that had found its shape. Daenerys lifted the cup. She did not pause for ceremony. She drank. Sansa watched her throat move as she swallowed, once, twice. The hall shifted back into sound, a laugh here, a scrape of a bench, a fiddle running easy along a string. Sansa set her own cup down with care, like a woman placing a sleeping child where it will not fall. Time lengthened. It often does in the quiet after a choice is made. Sansa kept talking, small words, farming talk with Lord Glover, a joke about chickens with a girl from the kitchen who had never spoken to a queen before and would brag about it to her grandchildren. Daenerys spoke with Jon, with Tyrion, with a boy who told her he had never seen a dragon and asked if they liked being scratched like dogs. She smiled at that. She said dragons were not dogs, but all living things enjoyed a gentle hand. Gentle hand. Sansa felt the shift almost before it happened, a tiny wobble in the world, like a table settling on an uneven stone. Daenerys blinked slower than before. Her hand brushed the table edge and rested there a moment longer than it should have. A heat rose in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. She looked toward the doors as if the distance had changed, as if space itself had grown strange. Sansa stood. She did it smoothly, easily, as if to greet someone. Her heart was steady. Her mouth tasted of cloves and iron and the memory of snow on the tongue when you were a child and dared to eat winter. She reached for the ewer again, offering more warmth to anyone who wanted it, letting the hall see ordinary motions, ordinary kindness, ordinary peace. Jon was the first to truly see it. He always noticed the small hurts before the big ones hit. His chair scraped. His voice said Daenerys' name softly, the way you say a name in a sick room. Grey Worm's hand went to his dagger, not to draw it, but to touch it like a talisman. Tyrion's face pinched, as if a long sum he had been adding for months had finally arrived at the number he feared. Daenerys did not fall. Not yet. She sat, her cup down carefully, and it made a bright, clean sound against the wood that no one in that hall would ever forget. She looked at Sansa again, and for the first time, Sansa saw something crack in those pale eyes. Not fear. Not anger. Confusion. As if the world had moved without telling her, and she was surprised it would dare. Sansa took a breath that she knew she would remember in the dark for the rest of her life. She stepped forward, not too fast, not too slow, and said calm, domestic words about fresh air and a walk along the inner yard where the snow fell soft and the wind was kind. She said it to Daenerys like any hostess would, to any guest who had sat too long by a hot fire. Daenerys nodded once, small, reluctant, as if the agreement had been pulled out of her by a thread. She stood. The room stood with her, like a wave, following the moon. Grey Worm moved closer. Jon moved too, the way a man moves toward a cliff to see how far it drops. Tyrion closed his eyes for a heartbeat and opened them a different man. They walked toward the side doors, toward the snow and the soft air and the place Sansa had chosen, because winter could be gentle if you asked it nicely. Behind them, the hall breathed and the music faltered, and then, brave or foolish, found its tune again. If fate had feet, this was the sound it made. Boots on old stone, slow, steady, honest. Sansa felt each step like a bell rung low in her bones. She did not pray. She had spent her prayers long ago. She only told herself the simple truth she had built this night upon. If she did nothing, fire would come again. If she acted, perhaps, winter would be enough to cool the world back into something that could hold a child's laughter without burning it away. The door spilled them into pale air and the hush of falling snow. The noise from the hall dimmed to a soft hum, like bees, behind a wall. The inner yard was kept clear the past days. Sansa had ordered it swept each morning so the ground would be even. The old ash tree stood by the low wall, its branches dusted white. Torches burned low, but not too many. She had wanted cold and quiet, not heat and shouting. Daenerys paused just beyond the threshold. The wind touched her face and seemed to cool something that had been racing in her blood. She blinked slow again and looked up. Snow caught in her lashes and did not melt right away. Grey Worm took one step to the side, placing himself so he could see the door and the yard at once. Jon hovered, hands not knowing whether to lift or hang. Tyrion stayed near the door and closed it behind him, not with a slam, but with care. Like a man who knows loud things sometimes start louder ones. "It's peaceful," Daenerys said, and her voice sounded like it had traveled a long way to get there. "Winterfell sleeps lightly," Sansa answered, "even when it seems at rest." Daenerys put a hand to the wall, as if to test whether the stone was real. She tried to smile, and the smile came slower than her mouth meant it to. "You're a good hostess." "I try to be a good protector," Sansa said. Grey Worm's gaze flicked between them. He saw small things. Men who survive too much always do. "What did you give her?" he said. No anger, just the simple question of a man who names facts. "Wine," Sansa said. Tyrion's breath fogged and disappeared. Warm wine for stiff hands. Jon stepped closer to Daenerys. He lifted her hand from the wall and cupped it between both of his. "Look at me," he said softly. "Just breathe." He looked over his shoulder at Sansa, and there was begging in the look, and something like accusation, and something like understanding. He didn't have words for any of it. Daenerys focused on him like she was climbing back onto a horse. For a heartbeat, the certainty came back into her eyes, the old, bright steel. "Did you know?" she asked him. The words were for Jon, but her gaze cut past him to Sansa. "I knew she would choose the North," Jon said, the truth scraping his throat on its way out. "I didn't know how." Daenerys swayed. Jon steadied her. Grey Worm moved, but Brienne stepped between him and Sansa, a wall of blue and steel. Her hand was on her sword now. It had been there since they stood. She had listened when Sansa told her sometimes doing nothing saves more lives than swinging. That lesson had ended. This was the other kind. "You will move," Grey Worm said. "Still even. Still the man who doesn't waste words." "No," Brienne said. Her voice could have been a door. Arya came like a shadow from the left where the torchlight didn't reach. One blink she wasn't there. The next, she leaned against the low wall, casual as a cat. Her knife wasn't out. It didn't need to be. The way she stood said she knew where every throat in the yard would be if they decided to make this ugly. Tyrion lifted both hands, palms open. "If anyone starts shouting, everything after will be worse." He was looking at Grey Worm when he said it, but the words were for the cold air itself. Daenerys' knees dipped. She fought the ground like a proud rider fights a fall. She lost, slowly, and it humiliated her that it was slow. Jon went down with her, catching her under the arms, bringing her to the bench under the ash. Sansa moved then, to stand near enough, to speak without letting it turn into a crowd. She kept her hands at her sides. She would not touch the queen. "What have you done?" Jon asked. And the question was for Sansa, and for himself, and for all the choices that had cornered them here. "I chose my people," Sansa said. "I chose a way that would not burn a city first. I chose a death in the snow instead of 1,000, in fire." Daenerys heard that. The words put a light back in her eyes. Not fire, but something like it. Pride. Rage trying to stand. "You talk like Cersei talked," she whispered. "You hide your knife in love." "I learned from Cersei. What happens when you bow to someone who calls their hunger justice?" Sansa said, and her voice did not rise. "No more." Grey Worm took another step, and Brienne's sword came half out, metal kissing air. The Unsullied at the door, two of them, silent for so long they'd looked like statues, shifted, spears angling. Arya's knife was just there, in her hand. like a thought you only realize you've been having when it comes out of your mouth. "Stop," Tyrion said, and put his small body in a large, foolish place, between Steel and the people he loved and the man who could kill him. Without blinking, "If you die here," he told Grey Worm, "they will all die, and then more will die after them. There will be no one left to say what happened, only stories told by people who think noise is the same thing as truth." Grey Worm looked at him like a man looks at a fly that speaks. He did stop. His duty told him not to waste the Queen's breath on a fight he couldn't win here and now. A sound rolled across the yard then, low, deep, old. Drogon. The dragon was not close. The sound came as if through the ground, a note from the earth's throat. Jon's head jerked toward the outer field. He felt the pull like a hook. Daenerys's hand twitched as if to reach. Her breath caught, then stumbled. The drug, sleep and slowing and a soft hand pressing on the heart, was doing its work. The Maester had called it a deep quiet. It would come like a long night, gentle if you let it, deadly if you fought it. Sansa had chosen it because she could not stand the idea of poison that burned. The world had burned enough. Daenerys looked, up at the slow snow and then at Sansa. "You think you are kind," she said. "You do not know yourself. I was going to make the world better. You were going to break it so it matched your dream," Sansa said, "and then keep breaking anyone who did not clap for the pieces." Jon closed his eyes like a man stabbed in a place no blade can reach. "Dany, please," he said. He was pleading with the air now, with choices already made. Rest. Just rest. He tucked his cloak around her, hands clumsy, gentle. He had tucked cloaks around dying men before, on other nights that smelled like iron and loss. He had never tucked one around a queen he had loved. The side door opened. A crack, and Bran was there, silent, chair wheels barely whispering. He seemed to look at something no one else could see. Maybe it was the dragon's mind, huge and wild beyond the wall. Maybe it was only the way snow falls at the exact same speed for kings and beggars. "Will he come?" Sansa asked, eyes flicking toward the white beyond the wall. "He feels her," Bran said. "He knows the shape of her breathing. He will not come into the walls. He knows stone is a trap. He will wait. He will rage. He will learn a new word. Alone. Alone." Daenerys's breathing went shallow, angry at how small it had become. She tried once to push herself up, a queen refusing a chair. Her arms shook. Jon's hands steadied her. She hated that she needed them. She hated that the last thing she would see would be snow and two women who would not kneel. She found Sansa's eyes, and through the last piece of herself she had left, the one no one had ever beaten out of her, belief. "I freed people," she whispered. "I burned monsters." "You burned children," Sansa said, and didn't blink. Daenerys flinched. It was small. It was everything. Tears came. Not pretty, not performative, just water the body makes when it can't do anything else. She made a small sound then, not regal, not powerful, human. It was the first time Sansa had ever heard Daenerys Targaryen sound like a girl. It was the last. Her head fell against Jon's shoulder. Her breath did not come back up. The quiet deepened, and then finished. No one moved for a long moment because moving would make it true. Snow went on doing what snow does, touching everything the same. Tyrion's face folded in on itself. He had been ready for this in the way men are ready to drown if they go near water every day. Readiness does not make breathing easier. Brienne sheathed her sword, the sound like a page turning. Grey Worm stared at his queen's still face, and some part of him refused to understand the shape his world had suddenly taken. He had no language for it. He had only orders. And the last order still rang in him like a bell. "You did this," he said, and the words were a flat blade pointed at Sansa's throat. "I did," Sansa said. Her voice was steady because it had to be. "I will answer for it." Jon lowered Daenerys to the bench as if setting down a crown that would roll if you let it. He stood and looked at Sansa, and there was nothing left to ask. There was only what comes after. Drogon's cry came again, closer now, a broken sound that made even the stones seem to flinch. The dragon would not come in, but he would not go far. The field would be a storm of snow turned to steam and earth, clawed into mud. Horses would scream, men would mistake sky for enemy. "We have to keep the peace," Tyrion said, voice soft but urgent. "If the Unsullied think this was a slaughter, they will take revenge until there is no one left to fear them. If Northerners think this was an invasion, they will answer until the last child starves." He looked at Sansa, then at Grey Worm. "Let the queen lie here until dawn. Let no man draw steel. Let no one die for a thing that is already done." Grey Worm did not nod. He also did not give the order to kill. He was a man built from commands. When the command is gone, the body waits. He waited. Sansa turned to Brienne. "Double the watch. No arrows loosed unless we are attacked. Open the lower stores, bread to the Unsullied barracks and hot broth. No one goes hungry tonight." "To feed men who might kill us," one captain muttered, too low and too late. "To feed men," Sansa said. "Hungry men burn faster." She stepped back then, giving Jon the space that was his by right of what he had lost. He stood by the bench, head bowed, snow in his hair, a man at the end of a long road that had led him nowhere he wanted to go. Arya watched him with a face that had relearned compassion and hated it for coming back. Bran turned his chair and slipped, away like a shadow that had decided not to haunt anyone just yet. Tyrion stood guard over silence, a small sentinel who knew that sometimes words were as dangerous as swords. Above the yard, ravens tucked their heads under their wings. Beyond the wall, a dragon mourned in a language without forgiveness. Inside the keep, winter held its breath and waited to see if the next sound would be a scream or a sigh. Sansa took one more breath of the same cold air as everyone else. Then, said the thing leaders say when there is nothing wise left: "We will get through the night. In the morning, we will speak." Dawn came grudgingly, a thin gray light that crept over the yard like it was afraid to be seen. The snow had stopped, and the world wore a hush that made every small sound feel like a choice. Sansa had not slept. She walked the corridors with Brienne at her shoulder and felt the castle breathing under her feet. Warm in some places, cold in others, like a body that had bled but not died. Word of the Queen's death moved without being carried. It went, through stone and skin the way winter goes through a thin cloak. The Unsullied formed in the yard outside their barracks before anyone called them. They stood in lines that looked like walls, faces blank, hands steady, spears held like a single thought. Grey Worm stood in front, and the air seemed to gather around him the way it does before lightning. Jon was with Daenerys still, where they had laid her in the small chapel chamber normally kept for old lords who needed a quiet place to go out. He had washed her face himself. He had braided her hair with clumsy fingers, not for beauty, but because it felt wrong to see it undone. When Sansa came to the threshold, he looked at her, and the room felt like a knife edge that both of them were trying not to fall off. "She should be burned," he said, "not put in the ground. It was her way. It's what she would have wanted." His voice was hoarse, rubbed thin from words that didn't change anything. Sansa nodded. "On the outer field," she said, "with honors. No mockery." She met his eyes and held them, even though she wanted to look away. "We will do it at dusk. If we do it in daylight, People will see too much and say more than is true. Dusk makes room for quiet. Jon swallowed. He didn't thank her. Thanks were too small in a room like this. Grey Worm will want blood, he said. He will want order, Sansa answered. Blood is one way to get it. I will offer him another. Tyrion arrived soon after, his face the color of old paper. He stared at the body, at the stillness that had made 1,000 choices for them, and then he looked at Sansa like a drowning man seeing a raft he didn't trust. They'll think it was a slaughter, he said, voice low. They will act like men who've been robbed in the night. Then we will light a candle, Sansa said, and show them the room. She looked at him. Stand with me. Not because you owe me, because you know what happens when rooms like this are lit, by fire instead of flame. He nodded once, like a man agreeing to let an arrow be pulled out even though he knows it will hurt. Outside, winter's breath fogged from mouths and hung in the air. The Unsullied stood, but the North stood too. Men with beards iced at the edges, women with knives tucked into belts like combs, boys with wide eyes who had seen too much and not enough. If either side took one step wrong, this yard would be red before the dragon cried again. Sansa walked out between them with Tyrion to her left and Brienne to her right. Arya had vanished, which meant she was exactly where she wanted to be. Grey Worm stepped forward. His eyes were chips of something that remembered warmth the way a scar remembers fire. You killed the queen, he said. Not a question. I am responsible, Sansa said. She didn't raise her voice. The yard raised it for her. She gave mercy to none who stood in her way, he replied. We will do the same. Mercy is not what I ask from you, Sansa said. I ask for sense. Your queen deserves rights without blood turned sour around them. The people you lead deserve food, not fear. If you take revenge now, the North will break, and in the breaking children will pay for what kings and queens decided. She took one step closer, knowing exactly how far Brienne could reach if she had to. You want justice. I cannot ask you to forgive. I can ask you to wait. Grey Worm's jaw tightened, a small movement that said everything. Wait for what? For you to give speeches? For you to call yourself a hero? Wait until dusk, Tyrion cut in, voice unexpectedly sharp. Wait until we burn her with the honors owed to a ruler who bled the world trying to heal it. He turned to Sansa because it needed saying. And then you will stand before men and women and answer for what you did. I will, Sansa said. The yard shifted, a low ripple of breath through two armies of people who weren't quite armies. Grey Worm's eyes flicked to Jon, who had come to stand behind Sansa, face set like stone that remembered water. For a heartbeat, Grey Worm looked like a man who had been offered a bridge over a river he meant to drown in. He hated the bridge. He also hated the river. Dusk, he said finally. We wait. But the man who killed the queen? I did. It, Sansa said again, before Jon could speak and save her in a way that would break everything. Not by blade, not by arrow, by choice. Mine. A murmur ran through the North like wind through wheat. Some shock, some admiration, some fear, more resolve. It settled, and for now that was enough. Sansa turned to the steward. Open the stores, she said clearly. Bread to the Unsullied and our own both. Hot broth, salt, no one goes hungry. She looked at Grey Worm. Eat with us, stand with us until night. Then we will lay her on the pyre. He didn't nod. He didn't refuse. He turned and gave orders, and that was as close to a truce as this morning would allow. Inside, the castle began to move again in the old ways that keep people from breaking. Pots set on fires, loaves cut, barrels tapped. Arya appeared at Sansa's elbow to say the outer field was clear, that the dragon had torn snow and earth to mud and then settled on the far rise like a black hill, waiting for an answer that would never come. "He won't come closer," she said. "He doesn't trust our walls. Smart creature." "Smarter than many men," Tyrion muttered. Tyrion muttered. Jon came to her when the sun bent low and the castle began to fill with long shadows. He stood without his cloak as if the cold could scour him clean. "You could have let me do it," he said. No accusation, just a truth that scratched at both of them. "You would have broken," Sansa said. "And then you would have walked into the snow and never come back. The North needs you to keep breathing." He almost smiled, a terrible thing that hurt to see. "Do they?" "Yes," she said. "Even if you don't want it." They walked to the field with a line of people behind them. The pyre stood high and careful, logs stacked like a promise. Daenerys lay on a simple board, her white dress turned silver by dusk. The dragon watched from the rise, head low, eyes like old embers. He made no sound. Grey Worm stood opposite Sansa, a line of unsullied behind him, spears upright, points dim in the failing light. Tyrion took a place near the front, small and stern. Brienne and Pod stood with the north. Arya hovered near the edge of the circle where darkness began. The Septon said words. They were not about forgiveness. They were about endings, and how even the worst among us started as children who looked at the world and wanted it to be kinder. He spoke for a short time, because long words were a kind of theft on nights like this. When he finished, the field breathed out as one. Jon stepped forward with a torch. He looked at Sansa, and the look said all the things they would never say aloud without breaking. She nodded. He touched flame to the wood, and the pyre took. Slow at first, then with a sound like 1,000 small sighs learning to agree. Fire climbed. The wind shifted. Heat pressed back the cold. The dragon lifted its head, and a deep, grieving sound moved through its body but did not break free. Sansa stood, her face hot, eyes stinging, hands clenched under her cloak where no one could see. She had chosen this fire. She would not look away from it. When it was done, when the flames sank and the night took the edges of the world back, Grey Worm stepped forward. His voice carried like a drum beat. "When the ashes are cold," he said, "we will speak of justice." Sansa bowed her head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. "At first light," she answered, "before the hall, with witnesses." He stared at her a long time, then turned and led his men away. The dragon stayed on the rise, eyes dull flames watching the place where a queen had been. The north drifted back toward the gates in clusters, quiet as snow. Tyrion stood until the last embers cracked, then touched Sansa's sleeve, like a man waking from a dream he didn't want and couldn't keep. "You bought hours," he said. "Sometimes hours are the difference between a massacre and a story." "Tomorrow," Sansa said, "we make it a story people can live with." Jon lingered, eyes on the dark mound of ash and charcoal. "If he calls for your head," he said, voice empty of everything but truth, "I don't know if I can stop him." "You won't have to," Sansa said. "You'll only have to stand where people can see you. Sometimes that is enough." She glanced toward the rise where the dragon brooded. "Sometimes presence is a cage stronger than chains." They walked back to Winterfell under a sky that had decided not to snow. The air was iron cold and clean. The castle gates opened. The watchman on the wall stamped his feet and breathed into his hands and watched his lady pass with her chin up and her eyes steady. That night, Sansa stood alone in the Godswood. The heart tree listened without judging. She spoke softly, not prayer, not excuse. "I did this for them," she said, "and because I could bear it more than he could. And because I did not trust the world to survive her." The leaves didn't answer. They moved anyway, a small sound like a hand over a child's hair. Morning would come. There would be a trial or something like one. There would be a realm to hold together with thread and stubbornness. There would be men who wanted to turn grief into a blade. There would be a dragon who had to learn the meaning of going on. Sansa touched the tree's cold bark. "We will get through the day," she told the quiet, "and then the next. And we will build a peace that does not apologize for breathing." First light came cold and bright, the kind of morning that makes you tell the truth because lying takes too much breath. The hall filled slow and heavy, people taking their places like stones finding the riverbed. Unsullied lined one side, a gray wall of men who had learned to survive by turning their faces into masks. The north filled the other, fur and leather, hard eyes above red noses. Between them stood a thin aisle like a blade laid flat. Sansa walked that aisle without a cloak. She wanted the cold. She wanted everyone to see her hands. Tyrion waited near the center, small and unhidden. Jon stood farther back, not with the north, not with the south, but caught between like a bridge that had forgotten which shore it loved. Brienne was a post of iron at Sansa's shoulder. Arya vanished and appeared as the light moved. You felt her before you saw her. Bran sat near the front, his chair quiet, his gaze somewhere beyond the wall, and yet exactly here. Grey Worm stepped forward, and the room shifted, as if gravity had decided to choose sides. His voice was not loud, it did not need to be. "She killed the queen." "I did," Sansa said. She said it plain, no speeches yet, no excuses. Tyrion lifted his chin. "Then let us speak clearly about what happens now," he said, and managed, somehow to make it sound like a favor. "There are only a few doors, and we must choose one, or the house burns down." A rumble moved through the north. The Unsullied didn't make a sound. Grey Worm's eyes never left Sansa's face. "Justice is simple," he said. "A life for a life." "Sometimes simple breaks the world," Tyrion answered. "And then you spend the rest of your life sweeping up pieces and calling that justice too." "Words," Grey Worm said, like he was spitting out a thing that tasted bad. "Bread," Sansa cut in, and the hall glanced at her like they hadn't heard her right. "There is bread today because I opened the stores for both, your men and mine. There are children alive today because we did not start cutting each other in the dark. Keep that in your head while we speak. There will be time to hate later, if you choose it." Tyrion stepped closer to the center of the empty aisle. He looked very small there and very steady. "Here is the truth. The queen would have come. For the north. She said as much before 1,000 witnesses. She promised a new world, and the first rule of that world was that anyone who disagreed would be taught better by fire. Lady Sansa chose another ending. But justice," he glanced at Grey Worm, "must still be fed. The Unsullied cannot walk away carrying nothing but hunger." "What will you pay with?" Grey Worm asked. "Gold? Titles? You think a coin fills the place of a heart?" Sansa drew a breath. "I will pay with my freedom," she said. The words settled like snow on stone. "I submit myself to judgment by a council of the realm, north and south. Not a sword in an alley, not a scream in a yard, a council that writes down what it decides so our grandchildren know how we did this. If they choose death, I will bow. My head, if they choose another price, I will pay it. But no one dies in anger today." Jon started to speak. She shook her head once. He closed his mouth, and it looked like it hurt him. Grey Worm's gaze flicked to Tyrion. "And who calls this council? The wolf who killed our queen?" "The realm calls it," Tyrion said. "Quick. Send riders from both sides. Summon those who still hold lands and oaths enough to matter. We meet in Winterfell because it is where the question stands. We meet soon, because open wounds fester. 7 days." "7?" Someone scoffed from the northern benches. "The South never moves in less than 7 months." "The South has fewer people left to argue with," Arya said from somewhere. That made a few men jump. They'll come fast. Fear runs. Grey Worm did not move for a long time. The hall breathed around him. A weak beam of sun found a gap in the shutters and drew a pale bar across his face. At last, he gave one short nod. 7 days. Until then, your lady is our prisoner. He looked at Sansa. You will not run. I don't run, Sansa said. He looked at Jon like a challenge and a wound. And you. If you try to free her, I won't, Jon said, and the words almost broke his teeth on the way out. Sansa spent those days in a room with a barred window and a chair that looked like every other chair she had ever had to sit in when men decided her fate. Brienne stood outside the door like a statue that had learned regret. Arya came and went, bringing rumors as if they were apples. Tyrion visited and talked about nothing, because nothing was easier than all the things. That mattered. Bran came once, rolled in, watched the dust in the light for a long time and said, "It will split, and not at the seam you think." Then he rolled away before she could ask him what he meant. Ravens flew like black thoughts over white fields. Messages went out with stamps and seals and the heat of hands. From White Harbor, from the Fingers, from the Trident, from the Reach, from a few towns in the Crown Lands that still had roofs and pride. Even from the Iron Islands, short and rude and yet willing to be counted. The South was tired, broken, and still full of men who wanted to decide things. But winter makes even lords practical. They came. The Unsullied watched everything with the patience of men who had been trained to wait until waiting itself becomes a weapon. They kept to their quarters, drilled quiet, ate the bread sent to them, and did not thank anyone for it. At night, a black hill watched from beyond the walls. Drogon did not leave. The ground where Daenerys had burned still smoked on mornings the wind lay down. On the 7th day, the hall filled again. It looked like a map had come alive and walked into the same room to argue with itself. Men in green and gold, women in gray and blue, salt-stained cloaks from the coast, dirt under nails from the riverlands. A blunt-faced lord from the Vale who spoke like a hammer. A lady from the Reach who smelled like roses over vinegar. Davos Seaworth with sea in his bones and sense in his hands. Jon Royce with armor that remembered better days. Gendry Baratheon, awkward in New Lord's clothes that fit his arms too tight. The new Lady of Horn Hill with her jaw set like a gate. Tyrion stood again in the center. His voice carried easier this time because people had decided it should. "We're here to answer 3 questions," he said. What is Sansa Stark's fate? What becomes of the Unsullied and their grief? And what shape the realm will wear so it doesn't crack in the next hard winter of men? He turned to Sansa. She stood, unchained, and spoke into a room that felt like a throat. "I did what I said I did," she said. "I will not waste us with pretty stories. I ended a reign that would have ended us. I did it with a cup instead of a sword, because I have buried enough children in my mind. I do not ask you to clap. I ask you to decide like people who remember what fire smells like when it touches a city." There were speeches then, because people love to hear themselves equal to the weight of their clothes. Royce growled about law. The lady from the Reach murmured about mercy and how it tastes better than blood in the mouth. Davos talked plain about ships and bellies and the small. Courage of not making orphans when you don't have to. Gendry spoke with his hands more than his voice. And when he did speak, it was about working iron that breaks if you rush the heat. Grey Worm said little. "She killed the queen," he repeated, like a tolling bell. "You ask us to live with that. We can, but we will not live here while we do." It was Tyrion who finally pointed to an old door everyone had been pretending not to see. "The Unsullied deserve a home where no one looks at them like a memory of fear," he said. "They have no wives, no children, no wish to kneel to any of us." The Queen spoke often of Nath, a quiet place, a promise she made to a woman she loved. Put ships at anchor, fill them with food, pay them with gold taken from broken thrones. Let Grey Worm take his men and go where the air is soft and the knives are less busy. Let our justice be that we didn't make more ghosts." Grey Worm's face didn't change, but something eased in the shoulders of the men behind him, so small you could have missed it if you didn't live by watching small changes. "We will not be your debt," he said after a time. "We will take no coin soaked in your pity." "Take it soaked in mine," Davos said dryly. "Smells like salt instead of pity. Easier on the stomach. I'll captain the first ships myself if it keeps boys from dying to prove how sharp they are." He looked at Sansa. "And the North?" Sansa didn't look away. "The North will be its own again," she said. "We bent south too many times. The last time broke more than our knees. We will not kneel. We will trade. We will speak. We will share roads and rivers, but we will not bow. Not to a man, not to a dragon, not to a dream." The hall rustled like a forest in wind. Some nods, some scowls. A woman from the Riverlands stood and said, "Good. Then maybe our boys can come home instead of dying in someone else's song." The lady from the Reach sniffed and asked who would sit the Iron Throne. Tyrion looked at the empty air where the throne should have been and smiled a little, tired smile. "There isn't one anymore," he said. "There's a red ruin where a chair used to be. Maybe that's a sign." They argued until their throats were sore and their bellies needed soup. In the end, tired people choose simple things. The realm south of the Neck would try a council of lords to pick their leader when they needed one. Names were tossed like dice. In the rumble, Bran's chair made no sound, and yet somehow the room found him. It wasn't a coronation. There was no crown. Only a nod of agreement among people who had run out of reasons to hate the idea of a quiet boy who didn't want anything except for people to stop breaking the world. He accepted with that distant look of his, like the job was a bird that had landed on his finger and might fly away if he moved too fast. "For now," he said, "until it holds." "For now," Sansa agreed. She met Bran's gaze and they didn't smile. They didn't need to. They were thinking of the same winter. Tyrion asked the last question, and his voice was gentle the way a knife can be sharp and still gleam pretty in the firelight. "And Sansa Stark?" There was silence. Even the fire paused. Then the old Septon got up on stiff knees and said, "We don't heal by cutting the hand that bandaged us. We don't learn by blinding the eye that watched the fire." He sat down again because the speech had cost him all his breath. The woman from the Reach tried to make it polite. "Exile? Then to some quiet place where she can do no more harm." "To who?" Arya said, and somewhere a few men flinched because they still hadn't learned where she kept her voice. "To your pride? She belongs here." It was Grey Worm, unexpectedly, who ended the matter. "You have your north," he told Sansa. "Keep it. We will have the sea. Keep your woman away from our shores." He looked at Jon then, and the wound reopened. "And the man?" Jon stepped forward before anyone could decide for him. "I will not sit in halls and be pointed at like a story," he said. "I will go north of the wall. There are people there who don't care about thrones or songs. There is work. I know how to do work." He looked at Sansa and managed somehow to smile a little. "You'll be fine without me." "No," she said, and then softened it, because love and truth don't always fit in the same sentence. "We will miss you. That is different." He nodded. That was as close as they could get to hugging in a room like this. The council rose and fell apart into relief and mutters. Deals were made in corners, as deals always are. The plan for ships to Noth took shape before the ink on the idea had dried. Davos had already talked to the harbor master in White Harbor the week before, because he was who he was. Bran accepted the burden of tying the South into something that wouldn't collapse if someone sneezed too hard. Tyrion took on the dirty work no one wanted: lists, grain counts, who would pay for the nails. Outside, under a milk-white sky, Drogon finally moved. He came to the field where the pyre had been and scraped at the ash with his great black claws, as if trying to find the shape that had been there. There was nothing earthly left to take. He lifted his head and sent a river of fire into the air, not at Winterfell, not at anyone, just at the empty cold above him, as if trying to melt a hole large enough to fly through into a world where the ending had been kinder. Then he climbed into the sky and turned east. The sound of his wings faded slow, like a story deciding to be legend. That night, when the hall was quiet again and the mess cleared and the benches stacked and the candles low, Sansa stood by the window and watched men set torches along the wall walks. It looked like a necklace of little suns on an old, stony throat. Tyrion came to stand beside her with a cup he didn't drink. "You kept the house from burning down," he said. "Somehow." "It's still smoking," she said. "It always will," he said. "That's how houses are?" He put the cup down and looked at her straight. "I can serve your brother," he said. "Help him keep the South from tripping over itself. But if you ever need a man who knows how to count knives and lies, send for me." "I will," she said. "And if you ever need a winter that tells the truth, come north for a week and let your bones learn it." He smiled at that, a real one, tired and sweet. "I'll bring better wine," he said. Jon left at dawn 2 days later with Tormund and a handful of quiet men who liked the sound of ravens and the feel of snow. Ghost went with him, of course, the great pale shadow clearing a path without meaning to. Sansa went to the gate and watched them go. They didn't speak much. They never had. He squeezed her hand once, and she squeezed back, and that was their prayer for each other. Arya hugged him like a sister who had learned too late how to do it and promised to find him new stories from west of everything. He laughed then, and it made his face look young for a heartbeat. The ships left a week after that, black-ribbed and belly full of supplies, sails fat with a wind that smelled like iron and hope. Grey Worm stood on the deck of the lead ship and did not look back. His men stood in their straight lines and did not wave. Davos swore at the tide and then coaxed it like an old friend. People on the docks didn't cheer. They watched, quiet. And when the sails were little teeth on the line of the sea, a few of them breathed like they had been holding it since the bells in King's Landing tried to save a city and failed. Seasons turned the way they always do, in spite of crowns and graves. Winter hung on, mean and stubborn, and then it softened. The wall stones melted their sugar icing, and the yard mud tried to eat boots again. The first lamb bleated, and everyone smiled like fools at the sound because life is rude that way. It keeps coming, even when you haven't finished counting the dead. The day the northern lords gathered to name Sansa their queen was not loud. There were no dragons. There were no southern trumpets or knights jangling like pride. There were women with clean hands placing a white cloak on her shoulders. There was a circlet, simple iron with a vein of red that caught the sun. There was Lyanna Mormont's cousin crying openly and pretending the wind had punched him. There was Bran watching with an old, faraway sadness that somehow blessed the room better than any prayer. Arya stood near the back, eyes bright, a knife at her belt and a map in her head no one else knew. Tyrion was gone south by then to count grain and heads and try to convince men that eating and not killing are cousins. Sansa stood and they called her Your Grace, and her knees did not shake because she had practiced being steady in harder rooms. She spoke about roofs and roads and keeping promises. She did not promise glory. She promised bread. She promised that if the South called for help, the North would listen, but not kneel. She promised that the children would learn their letters, and their stories, including the ones that made them ashamed, because shame keeps you honest better than flattery. She promised to keep the hearths burning, and the wolves fed, and the gates open to the kind of strangers who come with empty hands and not full swords. After, when the hall emptied and the weight of the crown sat quiet on her head, she stepped into the godswood alone. The leaves were red and soft, new growth after a hard year. The heart tree's face looked the same as always, sad and kind, and a little amused. She touched the bark. It felt like skin that had forgiven 1,000 small hurts. I chose wrong. Things to avoid worse ones, she said, because saying it aloud made it easier to carry. I will do it again if I must. I will count the cost every time, and I will not lie about the bill. The leaves whispered nothing and everything. A breeze moved, smelling faintly of thawed earth and last year's apples. She stood there a long time and let the quiet tell her she was not special. She was only responsible, which is harder and better. That night, snow came again, thin and polite, as if winter couldn't help itself. Sansa stood on the battlements, crown cool on her hair, cloak warm on her shoulders, and looked out over a world that had finally stopped screaming. Fires dotted the dark like 1,000 small life decisions. Somewhere, beyond the trees, a wolf called and another answered. Somewhere far to the south, a boy king who didn't want to be a king tried to teach people how not to tear down the house they lived in. Somewhere east, a dragon told the sky his grief, until even the sky learned it by heart and softened at the edges. Sansa breathed in. The air tasted clean. The crown felt heavy and right. She did not feel triumphant. She felt what leaders are supposed to feel when the singing stops and the sweeping begins. Tired, steady, a little scared, and sure enough, the North slept. The realm did not break. Not today. Tomorrow would come with its own teeth. She would meet it at the gate with bread and rules, and if she had to, a knife hidden under a welcome. She didn't have to love the choices. She only had to make them and live with them. She did.